just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. But just be respectful, dudes, and never learn until it's too late. Have a good time.
Welcome to the Baltimore Bureau podcast.
Yeah.
The only place on the real news where we talk with our hands.
Hi,
I'm Dharna.
I am Baynard Woods.
I'm Easy Jackson.
So what are we doing? We don't have headphones on today. You may notice if you're watching rather than listening. And that is because our audio engineer, Stephen Frank, is away today. Fortunately, not doing all internet all the time. Yeah. And so thank you, Chris, for helping us out to get this going.
Chris.
Yeah.
What do we got coming up today? What have we been doing this week?
So I think first we should talk about, you had a huge story come out this week, Baynard,
Yeah.
that you've been working on for a really long time about the Internal Affairs Department of the police department here. Internal Affairs. If you want to start something.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of about, it's not really about the Internal Affairs Department, but about the, it was one of those headline double entendres about the mental health of this guy, Larry Smith, who really struggled with mental health issues as a police officer. The story starts with some news sort of breaking a story in the Gun Trace Task Force thing that Wayne Jenkins was supposed to be testifying at the trial board. Jenkins is the sergeant who ran the task force. At the trial board, an internal trial for disciplinary things for officers, Fabian Laronde, who was arrested again a couple of weeks ago, who's one of the sort of most notorious dirty cops in the city, was actually fired, and that probably saved him from being indicted. So maybe that was a big lucky move on his part. But Jenkins comes, this is in January of 2016. Jenkins kind of threatens Larry, tries to intimidate him, I guess, rather than threatens him, and also a lawyer who was involved in the process. And Jenkins then, Larry, a month later, not as a result of Jenkins directly, but a month later, Larry tried to kill himself and went into his shower with his gun and wasn't able to pull the trigger, was put on medical leave. The department really kind of just abandoned him, he felt, at that point, until he came back and went in as HR, did a couple psych evals and right before he was about to get his weapon back, also started to think, man, I'm going to use this on myself.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's really like this part where you talk about him getting ready to testify against Laronde, and then Jenkins comes over, is like the guy literally almost sat in my lap. That's how close he sat. Smith recalls about the January 2016 encounter. He put his arm on the back of the couch like I felt like we were on a date. He kept bumping my knee with his knee. He was asking me how I could feel good investigating real cops like Laronde and trying to guilt me, like telling me Laronde has kids and he's got bills to pay, and then I'm playing with his career. Like, this shit is real in terms of like how this club works to protect each other from doing this raggedy shit.
Yeah, to protect each other at doing the raggedy shit and to keep them from doing like everything's sort of set up to keep you from doing what's right.
Yeah.
Just came out now. Jenkins put in about 20 letters, is asking for 20 years now, had 30 letters of support in the court documents, and his lawyer's arguing that he had the Bathsheba complex, which I'd never heard of before, but it's how after King David and
I was going to say, this is Bible.
Yeah, and that after they lost a child, and he wasn't equipped to have power yet, he did all kinds of bad shit, and so that's what they're kind of arguing and asking for 20 years for Jenkins rather than more than that. But I really wanted this story to be sort of full of some surprises and to be a narrative and not to be, I mean, there's in journalism, there's the thing called the nut graph that, you'll if you open with an anecdotal lead like this, then it says, this is why this is important and this is why you're reading this. And I really wanted to avoid that at all costs and not have this lead that's like, today we talk about this important thing, and just to be able to tell this guy's story like that is his experience was a really, I think, valid and valuable experience for people to for me to try to understand, for people to read. And for me also, it's a real Gen X story that I don't know if y'all got that, but he worked at the Barnes and Nobles, and
he's
he was like a reader,
I want to be a poet.
and
I want to open a bookstore.
Was really into the beats and stuff, and so so that was part of what made him be a cop. Was like he didn't want an ordinary life. He wanted to experience stuff sort of outside
it's
of
adventure thing.
Yeah, so I check it out. It's on our site. It has beautiful photographs by Tracy Beal. It's our first really big print story on
our news
on the new site, and we have a couple more. We're gonna have one coming out today about comedy in the city and being used in classrooms, and then one coming out next week about a program that's teaching people to the biomedical field. So we have some ambitious multimedia print stuff coming out, and thanks to Larry for really talking to me and opening up and sharing his story in that.
It's really beautiful and really crazy to see somebody in the police department reacting to the way that some other cops are behaving. There's one point where he says oh, well, I guess that if I wanted to be let off for my mental illness, I should have robbed people because that's what happened to.
Right, because Allers a couple of weeks ago, the other gun trace task force sergeant was saying they used his argument that he had PTSD and that's why he did that. And Larry angrily texted me, I guess I should have robbed people to cope. And then I would have been okay. And he it wasn't a thing either where he was trying to be like Michael Wood did a few years ago, like he was some kind of hero or something. He was coming at it as I'm a deeply flawed person. And I was in this deeply flawed field, and I'm trying to make sense of it. And that's the kind of stories that I feel like I really like the best, or the kind of stories that
there isn't a hero. There's just
it's a person. And also, if you look around the details in people's lives, Tracy took the photos, and I was taking notes on what was in his room, and he's sitting beneath this Frankenstein old movie poster, and then I end with that image, but and without hitting over the head with it, that image, that's the whole thing. We as a society are the Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, and we try to make these monsters with police who do the things that we don't want them to do. That we don't want to know about them. We want to keep hidden from that. And then when they get sick or hurt or whatever, we're just hey, you're on your own.
And then you have other Frankensteins, evaluating the Frankensteins. There's this amazing thing where he explains you have to be inside enough to be, when you're in the Internal Affairs Division, you have to be inside enough to be considered a cop, but you're not really considered a cop because you're the cops for the cops. So it's
And then the amount of trauma that the people in the city are facing, and that when you think about some side street in the middle of the night where two armed people who are both dealing with trauma are confronting each other, there's just no way for that to end well. Well, we're starting off on a peppy note this Friday morning, but this is it is serious shit, and that's where we are in the city right now. And there's all of the poverty and stuff that's coming in, and
that leads to all that trauma. It's often who the police are policing are folks who are experiencing trauma, not just because of the police, but because of generational poverty.
Right.
And so again, Eddie Conway went up to Annapolis this week. The Poor People's Campaign is all over the country. They're having every week on Mondays for Moral Mondays, reminding us that poverty is a moral issue. And they're going up and getting arrested. And so this is a really beautifully shot piece, and a really nice piece that Eddie Conway, who is really one of the great sort of treasures that we have here with his wealth of experience, goes up and talks to some people about it. So let's check it out.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Annapolis. For the second week in a row, we're covering the Poor People's Campaign.
Everybody's got a right to live.
The president says Mexican immigrants are animals. We are not animals. But if I was, I would be a Black Panther, fighting for racism and inequality.
People today are here and putting their bodies on the line to protest
those assembled, we stood in a circle, and then the leaders started calling for the demands loudly, and we were responding, when do we want it? Now, the same demands. And an officer from the State House came and let us know that the rules in the State House is that things need to be done quietly and decorously because there is business being done, and he told us we needed to be quiet or leave. Actually, he told us we just had to leave. And so those of us who were not risking arrest left, and those who did stayed and continued to make those demands, and we saw that they were taken away by the state police. I have a lot of privilege as a white woman, as a cisgendered woman. I have relative affluence, and I'm realizing in the past 3 years since Freddie Gray died just how much of privilege I have, and I'm trying to do what I can to use it to amplify others' voices. So the Poor People's Campaign, this call that poverty is not an economic issue, it's a moral issue, that gets to my heart. And so if I can lend my privilege to that voice, then I want to stand up and do so.
Well, if anybody's out there in the public that's my age, it's a good thing to stand up for what you believe in. You can bring your friends, it's all a family environment, and hopefully we keep on coming out here, hopefully we can get it done, and they'll finally realize that we need our rights.
We can end all the poverty in the world if we can, find the power of love. But we can start in this country by finding the power of love, and by really realizing that all the people who don't have enough to eat and don't have enough to live are our brothers and sisters.
So how do you find this power of love with people like Trump and Pence and Tillerson and people that don't care about the environment or other people? How do you find this love in their heart to change things which they're trying to reverse?
It's the power of people all over this country of loving each other who can come together. And so it's going to mean that what Trump and Pence and Tillerson and all these other people do is not going to mean so much if there are millions of people who are acting in the power of love. That's what the power of love means.
Ain't gonna let systemic racism turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let systemic racism turn me around. Gonna keep on walking.
All right, that was Eddie Conway with Cameron Granadino from the second week in a row at the Poor People's Campaign action in Annapolis. Last week they were not there when folks got arrested. This time they made it their mission to stick around when folks were getting arrested.
And that really takes, to get arrested for something that, to draw attention to something is... So often we don't pay attention to it, and people are willing to put themselves on the line to draw attention to their poverty or to other people's poverty because we're not ignoring that. And so, that whatever cause you're doing it for, it takes a lot of courage to willfully put yourself into the criminal justice system, especially if you're poor.
Yeah, I like the woman Tracy Godecker and how she talks about, her white privilege. We talked last month on here, celebrating Freddie Gray or, the anniversary of Freddie Gray and just continuing to reflect and look back, and she talks about, like, since that happened, I realized that, I was of a certain privilege and that these things were going on around me and that lending, lending myself or sacrificing my body to help this issue was important. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the awesome things we don't hear about or highlight as much, you know what I mean, is the amount of people that have since 2015 come out of the woodworks and trying to do something. So yeah, good job.
I feel like 2015 was here and that Trump maybe did it nationally, but it's like that ride at the fair where you're like on it and then it starts spinning and the floor drops out and you like everyone went further to where they were at some way or maybe changed, but you think you're close to someone ideologically, like, we're like, and then whoosh, and you're against the wall and you're not close to them at all.
Wow.
And there are other events historically that Brown versus Board of Education, I think, was a huge one of those events, and we're really trying to. You're always laughing at my transitions. I work on these.
He's so good at it.
Seamless
Sorry, I'm so
transitions.
He's
sorry.
so good
I didn't laugh. I'm laughing with you.
I really, all writing is about transitions, and I really try on this, and then just
I'm really
you
sorry.
just
I feel really bad. We can cut this part out.
So we go deep here at The Real News and try to explain the fault lines and not just the earthquakes. And so this isn't exactly a local story. Jessel Noor has been talking about this book for a while that I also read most of.
Yeah, obsessively.
Democracy in Chains, and written by Nancy McLean, a professor at Duke University. And she goes back and excavates the ideas behind the radical right now and how they come from this, and they go through Koch money and come from this program at George Mason University that was really trying to fight against integration of schools. And once they were integrated, then let's just destroy them and move towards this sort of Betsy DeVos stuff. And so this is the first of two parts that he talks with her. Next week's will be more about Brown versus Board of Education, but this is really fascinating stuff. And they also, it came out since she wrote the book, they really attacked her. All of these Koch-funded people attacked the author of the book, and through FOIA requests, they discovered that at George Mason University, the Kochs actually get to say who's being hired in these programs that they fund. And so it's just, it's really crazy.
2018 has been the year of the teacher, as waves of protests in mostly Republican-dominated states, starting in West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, and most recently North Carolina, have challenged not only low pay, but tax cuts and the privatization that have crippled public education.
The state keeps asking more of us every year, but giving us less resources. So that's one of the big reasons we're here to fight today.
These states have all adopted policies backed by right-wing billionaires like the Koch brothers, whose network of dark money funders has poured untold sums into transforming the American political landscape by shackling the government's ability to fund social services and enforce regulations while cutting taxes on the wealthy and increasing protections for corporations, all while passing a slew of restrictive voter laws in the name of advancing so-called liberty. A number of reporters and scholars have written works that have shed light on the workings of the shadowy networks of the right-wing billionaires like the Koch brothers. But until now, there's been little understanding of the origins of the ideology behind this assault on democratic institutions. That led our next guest, Nancy McLean, the William Chafee Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, to look into the ideological foundations of this movement. And what she uncovered is deeply shocking and troubling, the subject of her explosive book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Really happy to have you on.
Great to be with you.
So for the first part of this discussion, let's start at George Mason University, where you stumbled upon a remarkably unguarded trove of documents belonging to the late Nobel Prize-winning economist James McGill Buchanan, and what you were able to piece together about his role in the Koch brothers' plans to reshape America and its democratic institutions. Talk about how you came across this and what you started to piece together.
Well, James Buchanan had been on my radar from some historical research that I had done on the state of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education in the late 1950s, and I became intrigued with him. And when I finally was able to get into his private archive at George Mason in 2013, I found all of my suspicions confirmed about the ways that his ideas were being weaponized by the Koch donor network in order to effectively disable our democracy and to do things like privatizing public education, inflicting these radical cuts in necessary social services in the country, changing constitutional law, all kinds of things I was able to find in that archive. And ironically, I got into the archive in September of 2013, just as Buchanan's ideas were guiding a government shutdown in Washington, D.C., led by Ted Cruz, a figure deeply steeped in both this thinking and rooted in the Koch network. So very, very I would say, unsettling experience to be in the archives during the day while watching the damage being inflicted on Americans who needed the federal government's services and needed the government open during the time I was at the archives for the first time.
So limiting democratic participation and empowering the wealthy is nothing new in American history. What's different about Buchanan's work? What makes his ideas so radical and so dangerous to democracy?
Yeah, Buchanan was playing on the same team as the wider right with people like Milton Friedman and others who believed in a kind of free market fundamentalism, believed that government was the problem, believed that the solution was to turn decision-making over to the market for just about everything. But what was different about Buchanan is that he came up with a theory of how government grew over the 20th century, and particularly the domestic part of government, what is sometimes called the liberal state. So things like Social Security and Medicare, workers' rights, environmental protection, anti-discrimination, and so forth. He produced a theory that was aimed really to discredit government so that people would not automatically look to government in cases of market failure. And that turned out to be a much more insidious and in the long run effective approach to undermining the popular achievements of the 20th century. So Buchanan's approach was complementary to that of Friedman and the Chicago School and others, but again, much more devastating. And we see it today in all the language about the swamp, the notion that all public figures are corrupt and misleading the public. All of those ideas really stem from a school of thought that Buchanan developed called public choice economics most broadly, and his particular variant was often called the Virginia School of Political Economy. So
a historic figure sort of plays big in this, in your book, James C. Calhoun, who was a slave owner, a former vice president, a statesman from South Carolina, who had a lot of influence in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. What role, so talk about who he is and his significance, and what role he had on the thinking of Buchanan and other influential figures in this libertarian arch-right movement.
Yes, before James Buchanan, John C. Calhoun was the most significant anti-democratic thinker in America. He was a Southern slaveholder from South Carolina, one-time vice president, South Carolina member of the U.S. Senate, and he produced two big treatises reinterpreting the Constitution and the purpose of American government in a way that would protect slaveholders' interests. He did this a generation after the founders, and he did it because he could see that national majorities were developing that would challenge slavery, and he wanted to protect what had become the most profitable capitalist institution in the mid-19th century when he was writing, or I should say the early 19th century, the first third of it, in the 1820s and 30s in particular. And basically, he was a theorist of what I've come to think about as property supremacy, a kind of property supremacy that reinterprets the Constitution in order to protect the absolute prerogatives of property holders, the most dramatic being slaveholders, in order to keep democratic government at bay. And what's really interesting about Calhoun is that Buchanan's own colleagues at George Mason University have called John C. Calhoun a precursor to modern public choice theory, in particular to the ideas of this figure, James McGill Buchanan, their former colleague. And they actually said that the two systems of ideas had the same purpose and effect. And I could not agree more with that, because I think the purpose is to protect the rights of property holders, particularly the wealthiest among them, from the reach of majoritarian democracy. I think that kind of sums it up.
And can you talk about the response from George Mason University before and after they were recently forced to admit that this tremendous amount of money they were getting from the Koch brothers came with strings attached, which actually compromised their entire department, because the Koch brothers had veto power over who served, who could work at George Mason. Can you talk about that and their evolving response in this case?
Yeah, it's a really chilling story. I will say that I have direct personal experience of how poisonous a presence this Koch donor network is in our public life, because after my book came out, the initial review attention and media attention was universally positive and favorable from professional reviewers, from historians and others, and about 2 or so weeks in, 2 to 3 weeks in, there was this kind of libertarian pile-on, and much of it came from faculty at George Mason University who had been funded by the Koch network, who were working with the Koch implant on the campus at George Mason in the economics department, the law school, and something called the Mercatus Center, which interestingly is housed on the campus of this public university, but in no way accountable to it, and Charles Koch has sat on its board for years. So what we saw there is how the Charles Koch Foundation and the operatives that it funds basically are weaponizing their implants on our public university campuses in order to come after anyone who is critical of this operation. And there were a few researchers from Greenpeace and a wonderful group of young people who have built a group called Uncoke My Campus that researched the people who were attacking me and my book and found that in 90 cases, these were people who received faculty members who received direct funding from Charles Koch, or operatives in his various operations who in most cases never declared their conflicts of interest, basically violating Ethics 101 in these attacks. And the important thing about this is not the personal thing, the attacks on me, but what it tells us about how our higher education system is being used for this larger political project. And as you say, the recent revelations over the last few weeks of what has happened over the years at George Mason are quite breathtaking. In one case, a faculty member was chosen, hand-selected by a donor for a tenured position at this public university. And ironically, he was also the first out of the gate to attack me, this individual. So it is really stunning. The other thing that has come out in these revelations from George Mason is the extent of donor influence over faculty hiring and assessments of faculty performance. They were actually able to have a voice in getting rid of faculty if they didn't adequately advance the Koch donor project. And especially chilling was revelations from the law school, I should say, all made possible by FOIA inquiries associated with Uncoke My Campus and a group called Transparent GMU, FOIA inquiries that found that the Federalist Society, the body that has been vetting and recommending federal judges to Republican administrations since Ronald Reagan, the Federalist Society had actually set up a front group of the kind usually used in legal terms for money laundering, to funnel money to the now named Scalia School of Law at George Mason in order to use that law school as a base of operations for moving our judiciary to the right in terms of faculty appointments, setting up programs that could assist in this political project, and placing students in clerkships with judges on the right. So it is really mind-blowing for scholars to see what is being done to our universities. And although George Mason's administration at first denied this for years to their faculty senate and to the students who were concerned on campus, they have had to admit, now that these FOIA requests have become public, that in fact the donors had grossly undue influence on the campus that has corrupted academic integrity at this public institution.
Well, that's really tremendous, and it sort of demonstrates the ideological conviction over the academic, academic conviction of this group. So this wraps up the first part of this discussion about Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean. In our next part, we'll focus on public education and why this assault on democracy has been so closely focused on it.
All right, so that was Jessel Noor on the first part of his interview with Nancy MacLean. We'll see the second part. It should be up by the same time this is or so, but so you can look at it on our site or you can go later. I'm not even going to try to make a transition.
Donna Doo-Doo. Sorry. Donna Doo-Doo. Donna's got a doo-doo story.
See, when you don't have my transition?
That's my
look
transition.
at what you get.
You want Baynard to do these transitions.
I deserve all of this.
So you talked to some activists. You're working on a big, long, super good story, and there are little bits of it are coming out now in interviews. And so you've been talking with some activists about the city's promise for zero waste.
Yeah. This interview that you're about to hear is with two folks from Energy Justice Network who work here in Baltimore and in Philly and in DC on sort of green energy issues. And this is about basically, so last year, through a number of different resolutions and bills that were passed, Baltimore City Council vowed to push Baltimore towards zero waste. They said that they would aim to have zero waste in like phasing out the use of the incinerator. They were going to try to lower incinerator emissions, up recycling programs. And a bunch of officials signed on to that, including folks from the Department of Public Works here. But then the Department of Public Works, a week ago now, put out this request for proposal to a closed set of contractors where they basically asked a consultant to look into the positives of incineration and using the incinerator until 2040 and possibly privatizing the landfill and filling up the landfill, because if you fill up the landfill, you can profit off of it. So in response, some activists and Mary Pat Clark, wrote this city council resolution that passed unanimously. They're not binding, so we'll see what happens with that. But this interview with folks from Energy Justice Network just talks about the importance of advancing towards zero waste. And it's interesting because they acknowledge, like, if you say zero waste, it sounds like completely impossible pipe dream. But they talk about the concrete steps that we could take, like not using the incinerator, like filling up the landfill more slowly, like encouraging people to recycle.
And one of the good points that they made is like that they're setting a goal. When setting zero waste as a goal, like really makes sense, as opposed to like you would never say our goal is to have 5 homicides, and your goal is always to have
5 work injuries on the job.
Yeah. Actually, we do try to set goals of like let's get down to 200 murders. So I guess that's wrong. We do have insanely. I got back to that dark place. Let's stay away from that and go and stick with the environmental terrible stuff for a moment.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Dharna Noor, joining you from Baltimore. Last June, Baltimore City Council passed a zero waste resolution urging the city to reduce its waste output. Backed by city officials, including the Department of Public Works, this resolution was set to, quote, advance sustainability, public health, and job creation. But now activists are saying the Department of Public Works is going back on their word. The DPW issued a request for proposal, or RFP, with the Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority called Less Waste, Better Lives. The RFP calls on a closed set of consultants to bid over $450,000 contract to explore future directions for the city's waste management. Its directives include studying the positive aspects of incineration and privatizing, possibly, the city's Quarantine Road landfill. In response this week, Councilman Mary Pat Clark issued a council resolution that calls on DPW to change the RFP to align with the council's zero waste goals. The resolution just passed unanimously.
This is a resolution that reflects really this council's commitment to zero waste. And the advocates who stepped forward and said that if we're letting out a contract for a 30-year plan about recycling and solid waste, we should be sure to mention this council's consistent emphasis on a zero waste plan for Baltimore City, one in which incineration becomes a thing of the past in not the distant future. And so this is a blend of the request for proposal that is out and the new council that is in, and working together to put together zero waste with a plan that's going forward. And that is the purpose of this resolution, to bring those two extremes together and to make it the future of Baltimore City.
And with me here to talk about all this are two guests from Energy Justice Network. We have Mike Ewall, who's the Energy Justice Network founder and director. We also have Dante Swinton, who's the group's Baltimore Zero Waste organizer. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Before we talk about the specifics of the RFP, I guess, what does zero waste mean for Energy Justice Network? We can start with you. I know that, Dante, you were there this past week when this resolution passed. You were also there last year when the previous resolution passed in City Council.
Yeah. So for us, and I can cover anything I miss here, zero waste is the idea of keeping material that we use, typically kind of in the cradle-to-grave system as we have right now, out of landfills, out of incinerators. So instead of producing those materials and then just burning them or burying them, we actually utilize them in a different manner and keep them from being removed from the system. And so here that would be adding increasing recycling, increasing composting, trying to find the best way to diminish the amount of material we send to landfill or even to the incinerator currently. And Baltimore's a long way from that, and so this feels like the right time to start introducing those types of policies, especially with about 3 years left on the city's contract with the incinerator.
And how did y'all hear about this RFP again? I know that you said it was not made public on the DPW website, so how did you find out about it?
We found out about it from people who know people who are connected to consultants who had a chance to look at this. So it was not a public process. Usually this goes straight to a public website that the Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority has, but this was very much behind closed doors. The term zero waste sounds utopic because it has the word zero in it, but we urge people not to get hung up on that. A lot of cities and other local governments and even state governments like the state of Maryland have adopted zero waste plans. And it's just like having a zero safety defects policy or a zero drug tolerance policy or other kinds of things like zero injuries in the workplace. No one sets a standard that says, we're going to injure 5 workers a year. That would be crazy, right? So the idea with waste is to aim for zero and get as close as you can to it. And operationally, it means no incineration and getting at least 90% diversion away from landfills. And everyone knows the 3 R's, the other 3 R's, the reduce, reuse, recycle. And that's a simple version of the zero waste hierarchy, which has some other steps, including composting, to make sure that we keep waste out of landfills.
And why incineration specifically? I mean, I know that this is something that activists have taken specific issue with in this RFP. Why is it wrong to look at the positive aspects of incineration as it calls to do?
Well, that would be a really short study if they were, because incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. And it's worse than landfills. It's worse than coal plants if you're going to pretend they're energy facilities. So all of that is public data. It's out there. It's just that promoters of incineration that don't even like to call it incineration or waste to energy, and they use all these other euphemisms. They have this belief system that is not based in facts, that just perpetuates this idea that somehow incinerators are better than landfills, even though all they do is turn trash into, for every 100 tons, you get 30 tons of toxic ash that still goes to a landfill and still is actually more dangerous than the landfill in a lot of ways. And the other 70% become air pollution. That's not a good alternative.
And half the weight that goes to the landfill right now every year is incinerator ash. So it's not like we're fully getting rid of it at all.
So, but talk more about what you mean by worse. Like worse in what sense? What are the effects of that ash, of those emissions for people who don't know?
Sure. So for those who don't know, the incinerator is actually the city's largest air polluter. It accounts for about 37% of the entire air emissions from all city industry, which is crazy. That one white smokestack with Baltimore written on the side, people disregard when they just think of it as a monument coming into the city from the south, but it is far from that. So you have it being #1 in sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, lead, and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides contribute to asthma, heart disease, and stroke. Even 1 day of exposure to those pollutants will increase the lifetime risk of heart disease and stroke. And as I mentioned, mercury and lead is #1 in both of those in the city's industry. And so I did some calculations recently, and from the time the facility went online on average to now, it's released about 10,000 total pounds of lead over the course of its 34 years or so of being around. And it doesn't take very much lead to harm folks at all, children or otherwise. So we try to underscore the fact that this facility is not what people seem to think it is, and that it's causing a lot more damage than folks realize. In terms of its nitrogen oxide emissions, closing the facility would be the equivalent of taking about half the cars or half the trucks off of Baltimore's roads, just from one smokestack. And I mean, and that would be so beneficial not only from a health standpoint, but from a traffic standpoint, if we could do something like that. So, and it's just really a heavy polluter, and I think that people there's just not that connection between where their trash goes and what ends up happening to it and to them because of it. So.
Yeah, last year, last June, when this zero waste resolution was passed in City Council, shortly after there was also another resolution passed to reduce the emissions from the incinerator, right? So is part of the ask that this RFP meets those standards as well?
There are actually 4 resolutions passed so far. So there's the zero waste one. There was a very ambitious climate resolution passed the same month, last June. And then later in the year, in October, they passed a nitrogen oxides resolution. And this is because of this facility being close to 60% of all of Baltimore's industry's nitrogen oxide emissions from that one smokestack, and this being the pollutant that aggravates and triggers asthma attacks. And so the health department called for this, and the state is in the process of tightening the standards for how much a trash incinerator can put out of this pollutant, but they're only doing very modest decrease over what they're currently putting out. They're not making them meet the requirements of what a new facility would have to do, like the Energy Answers facility that was almost built here. It would have been the city's 3rd waste incinerator. Thankfully, that was stopped. But as a modern one, it would have had to meet a standard more than 3 times as strict as what they'll have to meet here.
So to move on from incineration a bit, the RFP also calls to fill up the city's landfill more quickly and even possibly consider privatizing it. So if landfills are in many senses better than incinerators for public health, for the environment, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to continue to fill up the landfill? Could privatizing it just make it more efficient? What's the issue here?
Yeah, I mean, I touched a little bit of base on it. So the landfill actually came online at the same time as the incinerator. The city wanted to lower its cost of waste disposal. They didn't want to send it outside of the city's boundaries or what have you. So the incinerator came on, the landfill came on, and like I said, half the weight that goes there is the incinerator ash. The existing landfill, which we still owe millions of dollars on, I believe it's about $17 million to finish. Has its capacity reaches capacity at 2026. And so what the city's been doing on top of ash and everything else that goes in there, they've bought this industrial landfill adjacent to it with the intention of expanding the landfill. It actually doesn't talk about that in the RFP, which I thought was interesting. But the plan is to keep the landfill open until 2052. It's very problematic to just believe that we can handle all of our trash by just burying it, when there's definitely a lot more possibilities with it. We've produced about 9 billion tons of plastic since the 1950s, and most of that is in landfills right now, which we could have actually been utilizing in different ways rather than just having them take up space in the landfill and otherwise. So.
One of the more important points to understand is that incineration is worse than landfilling, and we know that in terms of a study that we commissioned for DC, looking at incineration versus 4 other landfills that they have access to. And even though the landfills are 2 to 4 times as far in terms of trucking distance, now Baltimore's got a landfill within the city, but for DC it's a different story. Even with all that extra trucking, which turned out to be very insignificant, on majority of the 10 criteria that we looked at, including nitrogen oxide pollution and global warming, most of those criteria, incineration was worse, even though they didn't have to truck as far. And even on global warming, where the incinerator industry insists that they're a solution, which is preposterous, because they're 2.5 times as bad as coal plants in terms of the amount of CO2 coming out to make the same amount of energy. But we know, just objectively looking at this, that incineration is more of a problem and makes landfills more dangerous, because it's not the volume of waste that hurts people, it's the toxicity. And so even though we're sending a smaller volume and smaller amount of weight of waste to the landfill in the form of ash, we're sending it in a form that has more toxins in it, and those toxins are more available to leach into the groundwater and to blow into the community when they use this ash on top of the landfill as landfill cover. But to the privatization question that you raised, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is the #1 importer of trash. #2 is Virginia. Now Maryland's right in between. Why is Maryland not an importer? Well, that's because private facilities want to take waste from everywhere they can, and Maryland's been very smart in that all waste facilities except the Wheelbrader incinerator here and one landfill in Western Maryland are in the public sector. And when they're in the public sector, public entities want to preserve their landfill space and hold on to it because it's an asset for them. They're not trying to fill it up as fast as they can like a private company does, which is why you see Pennsylvania and Virginia dumped on so much. So to have this recommendation that maybe they should privatize it or intentionally fill it up as fast as they can to make a bunch of money runs counter to the long-term interests of Baltimore City. Baltimore County right now has an opposite strategy. They have a public landfill, and their strategy is to not use it, to prioritize sending Baltimore County's trash to be burned in Baltimore, take back less than their share of the ash that they're supposed to be taking their share of, but they're not taking their full share, and to dump anywhere else in Pennsylvania that they can.
And to be clear, they are taking some of the ash. They're just not taking the proportionate share of it.
Right. Only a few years ago did they start taking the ash back at all. Until then, all of it was being dumped in Baltimore's landfill, Baltimore City's landfill. But when they started, now they're up to taking 30% of the ash, but their share of the waste being burned here in Baltimore is about 36, 37%. So even though they're supposed to be taking their share, they're not quite there yet.
All right, so you have the second part of that story is also out now, so you can watch if you want to hear more about this. You can watch and keep watching for more of Dharna's climate coverage. It's really, I mean, there's you and Scott Dance are really the only people covering like one of the major stories that I guess the Brew is also doing good work in covering environmental issues. Sorry,
Yeah,
Brew.
until you started working on this, I got to admit, I didn't even know that tower, I didn't know that that's what that was. And it's like, I mean, it's a beautiful scenery, the part of that, like downtown landscape when you're coming off 95, 295 and stuff. And it's got Baltimore on it, and you always see it in everything.
Yeah,
like,
no,
you know
totally.
What I mean?
It's an amazing landmark.
Yeah.
And it's,
I had no idea that was what that was.
And you tried to get in there last week, and they didn't let you.
I did, yeah. After I was so excited when I was leaving the podcast when we were recording last week. I was like, oh, I'm gonna go see the incinerator now and get this tour. But the folks canceled just hours before the tour was supposed to happen. We were supposed to go with a group of students from a high school and some folks from Curtis Bay, and they said that, oh, the high school kids can't come, but we still want to have the community folks come in, and apparently that's not acceptable. And so we couldn't get the tour of the incinerator, but I will sometime.
Good, yeah. Keep on that. I've been there. It's crazy inside of there. People, y'all should contact us and let us know what you think. All of us are just our first names at therealnews.com, Baynard at therealnews.com, Dharna at therealnews.com, Easy at therealnews.com, and let us know what you think. I was told by one of our bosses this week that we're trying too hard to be cool, and I think that's just not true. We like each other genuinely, and we're not really. We're just kind of. This is what we all sit by each other back here too. Yeah. So this is sort of what you're getting a sense. Except we're usually like typing a little more wildly and stuff. But this is kind of what it's like to work in our little back part of the Baltimore Bureau. Yeah. And so, but let us know what you think. If you think that
we're trying to feed too.
Yeah,
definitely.
We're open to feedback. We can do some arguing if you want.
Yeah.
And you can feel free to donate and tell the bosses and everyone else here that you love the podcast.
Yeah,
that is the thing that you and rate us on iTunes and stuff like that, because apparently that's supposed to be good.
Totally.
For
Give
things.
us 5 stars and then write in the comments what you want us to talk about.
And if you give us 5 stars, other people will be jealous.
Yeah.
Speaking of jealous, didn't Mark Steiner interview Ben Jealous, who's running for governor?
But I've been jealous.
Oh my God.
That was trying too hard there, Paul.
Yeah, I was trying too hard to be cool.
That's an example of what I look like when I'm trying too hard to be cool. But we do have a great interview that Mark Steiner did with Ben Jealous. You can go back and see the way he's sort of grooming himself a little bit different. I interviewed him a couple months ago, and he's a little bit more gubernatorial, I think, and a little less campaigning for other people, and a little more seeming to be like it's been a few months of campaigning now.
Yeah, and this is an interesting interview too because, Mark obviously has this deep, long history in Baltimore, and he sort of asked Ben about his long history in Baltimore, about his family history here. and about the impact that his policy proposals would actually have on this city specifically, things like education reform, criminal justice reform. So yeah, we can end on
Take it away.
This.
Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Mark Steiner, and welcome to the Mark Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Today we're about to have a conversation with Ben Jealous, who's running to become the next governor of the state of Maryland. Has to get through the Democratic primary before. Of course, Ben Jealous was president of the NAACP, which is why many of you know who he is. He also has deep, deep Baltimore roots and joins us here in our studios at the Real News Network today. And Ben, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mark. It's
welcome.
good to be here.
So there's a lot to talk about in the time we have, so let's just jump into it. One of the things that you talked about was a single-payer system, or healthcare for all system in the state of Maryland. So the question is, I think, on a lot of people's minds, and the Republicans have already really attacked that, and I've seen it all through the web about the taxes it's going to cost us for you to do that. But when you look around the country, Vermont couldn't pull it off, and they had a smaller state, a progressive state, they had to back off, right? California decided not to do it.
For now.
And it seems that a lot of people would argue that even though it may be the best system for health care to cover for our citizens, you can't do it statewide. You can only do it nationally. So, I mean, how do you plan? I mean, one of the arguments in Vermont was that it was almost as much as the entire budget to make a single payer work in the state of Vermont. So how do you make that work in the state of Maryland?
You know, I think it's worth pointing out, you talked about California, there's a movement building there. And as we've seen with various pieces of legislation over the years, it takes more than one cycle. So now Gavin Newsom is running for governor of California. He's very clear that he intends to make California the first state to pass state-based Medicare for all. If California doesn't get there first, if New York doesn't get there first, we will here. You can look at the Rand Corporation's study on Oregon. And what they say there about Oregon is also true here. Oregon's 2/3 the size of Maryland, but 5 times larger than Vermont, at least, if not 6. It says that the most expensive option is the status quo. The most expensive option in America for healthcare is the status quo. Our healthcare system, we put more money in than any other Western nation, and yet our people get less care out of it. In Maryland, we have 350,000 people who do not have healthcare. It's the #1 cause of bankruptcy in our state. It's top 5 cause of untimely death. I spent 6 months of my life trying to move a factory from Canada to South Baltimore onto a block on East Reedbird Street, 3/4 of which is a public housing project, 1/4 of which is a brownfield. We would have put the factory in that brownfield. Day one would have brought 30 good-paying jobs with healthcare, low-skilled jobs that the residents of the housing project could have been trained in. Day 1,000, we estimated 300. The deal fell apart, not because you have to pay for healthcare here too, but because our healthcare costs under Governor Hogan have surged so much. They go up 10% or more a year. So as a small business person, my question is, how do I get a better deal? Because I'm committed. At Cape Port Capital, we're committed to providing health care to all of our employees. It doesn't matter to us if it's our healthcare costs going up or our taxes going up. The bottom line is that our bottom line is getting squeezed. And the only way that we can take on the pharmaceutical companies, the only way that we can cut the overhead, the only way that we can get a better deal for the people of Maryland, all of them, is to move to single payer. Canada started with 1 province. We can start with 1 state. The scale is big enough. We just have to have the courage to pursue a whole solution to a whole problem. You know, your mom, my grandma, we're both social workers here in the city. I'm sure your mom would say what my grandma says. She's 101 now. She says, baby, don't try to half solve a problem because you still got a problem. You got to bring a whole solution to a whole problem. And I'm proud to be the only person in this race with a plan. It's on my website. It's called MD Care, to bring single payer to our state. And the funny thing, I smiled earlier when you were talking about the Republicans. What the Republicans are afraid of is that I've already had people who voted for Trump approach our campaign, switch back to be Democrats in order to support our campaign over single payer because they're small business people on the Eastern Shore whose businesses are being squeezed by Hogan allowing healthcare costs to go up double digits every year. This is how we get it under control.
So let me ask a question though. Let me push that a little further with this. So as also a small business person, we have a small production company and we cover healthcare for our employees. Costs a lot of money.
And it keeps going up.
It keeps going up.
And you get anxious before the open enrollment period because you're like, oy vey, what's about to happen to me again?
And so it's not good. And the deductible stinks. I mean, it's very high. But the question still remains, I mean, how do we pay for it? Saskatchewan in Canada, I mean, it's a huge province. It was isolated, which is one of the reasons they could do it and did it.
And
huge as far as size, not so much people.
Right, and very isolated in terms of the rest of the country, in many ways. So, but the question is, how do you translate that to Maryland? How do you pay for it? I mean, when you have behemoths like Johns Hopkins, when you've got what just happened at MedStar closing their pediatric center because of the corporatization of medicine, that's a lot to control inside of that as well. You've got the insurance industry in Maryland, which has a lot of employees. It's huge in the state of Maryland. So how do you, I mean, that's a huge ship to turn around for single payer. I mean, what is the plan to make single payer work in the state, other than the fact that it would do us all better? How do you get there?
Well, one thing that we've said, you know, my plan on my website, very much based on the plan that Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders are all supporting in the U.S. Senate. Point out that they've also all endorsed my campaign as the only one to really unify Democrats to beat Hogan in our state. And it starts off with a period, and we envision this could take as long as 2 years, where you pull all the big players together to work it out. Like we've got, one of the things I excel in is pulling together big coalitions. I was trained young to help people identify their self-interest and then kind of pull them together and hold them together. I've done it throughout my career. So I was so successful as the youngest national president of the NAACP. And so we'll pull people together, major employers, unions, doctors, nurses, consumer groups, et cetera, to small business people to figure out a plan that works better for all of us. What we know is right now, how is healthcare paid for? It's paid for by employers, it's paid for by people. You pay your premiums, there's the employer premium, and those are basically the options on the table. I'd prefer to find a way for this to be done strictly through employer premiums. I think you need to have both options on the table. We know other states, when they looked at it, California, for example, said it would cost 10% more to cover everybody in their entire state. Well, that 10% number is important because our costs go up by more than 10% every year, and we're still not covering 350,000 of us. And it's the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the state. And so what you know is you can stretch the dollars further. How do you do that? One, there's a loophole in federal law that allows states to renegotiate with pharmaceutical companies. Those companies are, if they're not charging us twice as much as they're charging people in Canada and in Europe, they're charging us 5 times as much. We have to renegotiate with them. We know that the overhead for Medicare is 3%, but I have Blue Cross Blue Shield, it's 19%, and that's about what it is for all the other ones. Some doctors say that by the way, that they think it's even higher, but that they hide the costs and other things. Well, let's call it 18-19%. Well, for Europe, like I said, you know, Blue Cross Blue Shield, 18-19%. Medicare, 3%. England, France, Canada, 8-9%. We can cut overhead and stretch the dollars further. And then as Maryland, we've actually been running an experiment since the 1970s, which we accelerated 4 or 5 years ago at the end of Martin O'Malley's term, called All Payer, where we only allow each hospital to charge one rate for each procedure, no matter who the insurer is or which, and it's already saved us more than $580 million, and it's slated to save us $1 billion more over the next 5 years. That's the biggest step any state has taken so far towards single payer. It's saving us a ton of money. It confirms that as we continue down that road, we can expect to save money, and that's what we need to be doing when our small businesses are being choked and when people across our state are being forced into bankruptcy by our healthcare system.
So let me move on to a different subject here. Let's talk about your idea about cutting down prison populations by 30%. I think that's the number you used, right? Now, I've been covering this for a long time.
Sure.
And I've been pushing every candidate I've ever interviewed on this issue.
Yes. And I've got to be the first one who actually has a plan to end mass incarceration.
So let's talk about what that means. I mean, you've got two, I mean, you've got you may have a very recalcitrant General Assembly in many ways. I mean, look at the bill they just passed, which is pushing mass incarceration even more. You've got, again, this is a huge ship to turn around. You've got a corrections officers union. You've got people employed by the penal system. You've got you'd have to reform that and reform probation and parole in order to make this happen. You have to work with the judiciary to kind of figure out what do you do instead of incarcerating people. So I mean, so what is the plan? I mean, it sounds great, but again, I think our concern is how do you get there?
Sure. So one of the reasons why I'm confident we can get this done, I mean, there's a few reasons. One is we've already passed the Justice Reinvestment Act in Maryland, which by some accounts is working better than projected. Maryland has begun to shrink its prison system over the last couple of years, and there are different theories, but one of them is that the Justice Reinvestment Act is working better than projected. I'm confident because as president of the NAACP, I worked with governors and with bipartisan leaders in other states as conservative as Georgia and Texas, to push through wholesale criminal justice reform that has shrunk their prisons almost 30% in the last 3 years. So I know it can be done. And in order to empower us, as we were preparing to work with those states, I released a national criminal justice reform strategy for the NAACP. And Mark, when I did it, I mean, you would have loved this. I had every civil rights leader that you would expect to be there. I also had Grover Norquist, Newt Gingrich's spokesperson, because Newt was on a plane that day, with a 2-page letter of introduction for our report, of endorsement for our report, which proved very valuable in Georgia and Texas, because, you know, those Republican folks weren't going to read my report, but they'd read Newt's letter. And the head of the largest corrections officers union in the country. And this was the California Corrections Peace Officers Association. Their folks have been working 20 hours plus mandatory overtime every week for years, which some people think, oh, wow, they're excited to get that. Not really. It's destroying their families. They want time for basketball practice and baseball practice and to be home in time for dinner. And they weren't getting that because they were at triple occupancy in their prison system. And so what I know is that there is a common sense, bipartisan consensus to be forged. I've helped get it done in other states. We can do it here in our state. As the person who put together the winning campaign in Maryland to abolish the death penalty and who co-chaired the successful campaign to pass the DREAM Act, I know how to get big things done, and quite frankly, not just to deal with Republicans who may be distrustful of a progressive or a Democrat, but also, quite frankly, how to deal with Democrats who might be, inclined to be a bit backwards on these issues.
I mean, to be clear, in the state legislature, you have leaders like Senate President Mike Miller and others, who's a Democrat.
Yep.
Who's been in power for a long time and been in office for a long time as president of the Senate, is not going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, he goes to work in a building that's named for him.
Exactly. So, and getting that passed.
Well, let me tell you how we do it, because this is what I did. So here's the thing, right? Martin O'Malley tries to abolish the death penalty, could not get a floor vote. Ben Jealous comes back a few years later as president of the NAACP. I say to Martin, I say to the governor, I appreciate if you'd support me. He said, sure, if you can get a floor vote, but Mike Miller wouldn't give me one, so why would he give you one? What's the difference between me and our previous esteemed governor? I'm an organizer. And after a couple of months of me organizing...
I thought you were going to tell me you liked his bourbon. Right?
He's more of a Guinness guy, I'm more of a bourbon guy. But after a couple of months of me organizing Mike Miller's district, I ran into him at a Christmas party. And he said, Ben, what will it take to get your people to stop? It was the holiday time. We were phone banking his office. No one could phone in a holiday greeting, pick up the phone, somebody telling you to abolish the death penalty, give Ben his floor vote. I said, oh, Mike, you know what it would take. You just give me my floor vote. He said, Merry Christmas, Ben. You've got your floor vote. Well, that's how we got the vote to abolish the death penalty in Maryland. I'm an organizer, first and foremost. And as governor, I'll be an organizer, too. I tell folks, look, any politician who stands here and tells you that they're going to change the world by leading politicians doesn't understand how to change the world. It's not the politicians who give the people courage. It's the people who give politicians courage. Look no further than Parkland. Forget about the 7th and 8th graders leading walkouts. We've had 7- and 8-year-olds leading classroom walkouts. And it's given politicians more spine because they can feel the energy coming from the people demanding change. And so my campaign is a movement. We build a movement across this state. You see it in that we've got the lion's share of endorsements. You see it in that we have more individual donors than everybody else combined and a lower average contribution than even the guy running on the public option. And that's how I'll conduct myself as governor, too. I will first and foremost lead the people of this state. You belong to them as governor. And I will lead them in getting the big things done that we need done for all of our families.
So, a couple of really glaring things to me in all this. One is that it's good to cut down on our prison population. I think you got conservatives to liberals, progressives, people across the spectrum saying it has to be done.
Poor addicts need what rich addicts need. They need rehab. They don't need prison.
That's my next question. So my next question is, again,
how do we do it? How do we do it? I'm sorry.
And how do you pay for a rehab? How do you transform things so if somebody does get busted? There used to be, when there was federal money in the state, which doesn't exist anymore, there used to be money to have pretrial interventions so you can actually work with people to help get their lives in control and go on and lead productive lives, and it actually worked, but that's gone. And then the underlying cause of everything, which is the massive poverty that people face in places like Baltimore City and other parts of our state. So I mean, so without kind of an overarching look.
Yeah, well, then there's a whole lot there. But everything that we're doing in this campaign is designed to help alleviate poverty in Maryland. As Democrats, the people have to trust that we are committed to ending poverty. And for a quarter century or more, we've strayed too far from the roots of MLK and RFK and Shirley Chisholm and even a young Barbara Mikulski. From the roots of our party really being the party that is committed, yes, to civil rights and expanding opportunity, but also to ending poverty. And so we've talked about that with health care. Mass incarceration, you know, in neighborhoods like the neighborhood where my mom spent most of her childhood, Upton, Baltimore, we have $1 million blocks. We're spending $1 million or more to incarcerate adults from that block. Most of those folks, low-level offenders, many of them addicted. And so the plan I put on the table would change policing. We would go away from failed broken windows theory, which is basically bust people for little small things and keep your town safer, back to the old first things first policing, which says, we're going to focus first on homicides and rapes and home evasions and other serious crimes. Maryland, last time I checked, we had 3,700 unopened rape kits. That's an outrage. So under my administration, you would actually see more funding for expanding homicide units, expanding special victims units. You'll also see enough funding to finally fully fund our Safe Streets program. We've expanded it some, but it needs to be much, much bigger, to change how we do victim services so that people in the community are getting victim services help if they've been the victim of a crime, not, even if they haven't reported it yet. So important. Only 1 out of 5 crimes is reported, but yet 5 out of 5 crime victims is traumatized, and we got to make sure that they get the help that they need. And so when you do that, what you'll find is that we'll be sending fewer people to prison, but more violent people to prison, and that's exactly what you want. You want more killers and more rapists off the street, and yet you don't want your addicts filling up prisons. They should be filling up rehab. When you look at sentencing, first thing you have to understand is that it's usually done in an ad hoc way, and so you have new laws that compound old laws in ways that were unanticipated. So what we did in Georgia, working with the governor of Georgia and the then minority leader, now candidate for Governor Stacey Abrams, we in the NAACP and the Tea Party also, we were all working together, was to streamline that system so you took out the waste. And you kept violent people in for as long as they needed to be in, but again, you focused on rehabilitating the folks who are going to be coming out, making sure that they learn how to read. If I can make it easier for you to get a job when you get out, then I just made it less likely that you'll come back. And over time, we're going to shrink the system that way too.
But where does the money come from for all this?
What I'm saying
how
is
we
that
pay for this?
We have seen the systems in the states that we worked with when I was president of the NAACP shrink about 30%, close to 30% in 3 years. That saves you money. As somebody who's been a CEO or a partner in small business most of the years since I was 26 years old, what I reject is that doing better always costs more money. There's a lot of times when doing better just means managing what you have better. I'll give you an example. Our kids were freezing in the schools this January, made like international news. Our Lieutenant Governor, Boyd Rutherford, tweets out, "If those were my kids, I'd be very concerned," or something like that. I tweet back at him, "Hey buddy, you're the Lieutenant Governor, they're all your kids. So I guess I'll see you down here at North Avenue very concerned." He says, "What time?" I said, 3 o'clock. It was about 3.5 hours. It was time for him to get there. He didn't show up, I did. Bottom line was, I called Sonia Santelides, superintendent of the schools, and I said, CEO of the schools, and I said, "Sonia, do you have any boilers that are more than 30 years old?" She said, "All of them are more than 30 years old." I said, "That's really good news." She said, "Why is that good news?" I said, "Because that means we don't have to ask the state for new money to replace them." See, every boiler that's more than 30 years old is so environmentally inefficient and uses up so much power. And the new state-of-the-art heating systems, the best in the world, made in Japan, Norway, or the US, are so inexpensive to both buy and operate that if you can just get somebody to finance the purchase of the new heating systems, you can pay them off. And they say in 2 years, so definitely in 4 years. But they'll last you like 20 years. And so you can actually look forward to, one, spending less money on your power bill and more money on school, but also to higher student attendance. And she's like, "Because the kids won't be freezing?" And I said, "No." I said, "That too, Sonia, but because all those boilers are producing smog. and the smog recirculates through the building. And that triggers asthma attacks, and that triggers absenteeism of both teachers and students. That's what it's like to have the heart of a civil rights leader and the mind of a business person who says, you know, I just reject the notion that just because we have limited funds, we have to do things badly. We should use that as inspiration to find a better way. And so it is with our criminal justice system. We know we can cut it, we can save money, and then we can reprioritize that money for rehab, we can reprioritize that money for public higher education. We also, when we look at our healthcare system, the number one question we should be asking politicians is how can we afford the status quo? Because under the current regime, Hogan has healthcare prices going up more than 10% every year. Who can afford that? I know I can as a small business person. I know I talk to small business people across the state. They can't afford it. And then I have to sit in churches with individuals who are homeless because they got hit by a car when they didn't have health insurance and it wiped them out. That shouldn't be able to happen in the world's wealthiest democracy. It's fundamentally about spending our money better.
So you mentioned Governor Hogan.
Yeah.
And all the years I've watched politics in the state of Maryland, or participated in it, or covered it, or whatever, right? All those things. I have never seen a sitting governor that seems to have created so much satisfaction, despite the things you're laying out here, among the people of the state of Maryland. You see 47% approval rating, or they don't align him with Trump, or all the other things they say. And he's also turned out to be, I think, a really good politician.
Yes. He's slick.
Very, free community college tuition, and sitting there with Mike Miller and Speaker Bush. So how does any Democrat take that on at this point? Because clearly people have felt that most previous Democratic administrations in the state of Maryland, at least in living memory, have been detached from the people, have been detached from the state, which is one of the reasons Hogan won. We can talk about...
You speak to the people about solving the real problems that are facing them, solving those whole problems. But solving our healthcare crisis, solving our student debt crisis, solving our mass incarceration crisis. We don't just have the most incarcerated black people and brown people on the planet, we also have the most incarcerated white people on the planet too. And what they all have in common is they tend to come from zip codes that are low-income zip codes. So you get in there and you talk about that pain, ending the opioid crisis, ending police killings of unarmed civilians. And that's what we've been doing. And that's why I've succeeded in getting the lion's share of endorsements in this race, and building a bigger army of supporters than anybody else. Larry Hogan is playing by an old politician's playbook. The widest lane to re-election is to do nothing. You talk about community colleges. All he did was get straitjacketed by a Democratic supermajority into signing a bill to put $15 million into our community colleges. It will not provide free community college tuition for everybody. It'll make it more affordable for some people. What I've put a plan on the table to do is to, frankly, tax the 1% and 1% more. And then pay for community college tuition again for everybody. Why? Because we used to pay for it. We used to pay for it for everybody. Our colleges, if you go back a day before mass incarceration, were tuition free. Somebody said, even the rich kids? I said, yeah, even the rich kids, because their parents will be paying for it. We're taxing the 1% more. But you and I both know that it's time for our society to go to making 13th and 14th grade free. Just like a long time ago, we made 9th, 10th, and 11th, 12th grade free after ending years of only having public education through the 8th grade. Because we needed to for our economy, and that's what we need right now. And the people of Maryland are willing to accept that sometimes we've got to invest a bit more in order to get a whole lot stronger. I look forward to taking on Larry Hogan. Larry Hogan, we've been told for a year, we're the only campaign he fears. Why? Because he got in office through low voter turnout. It was the lowest Democratic turnout on record in Maryland and the lowest nationally since 1942. Well, my running mate, Susie Turnbull, a cycle earlier, when she was chair of the party, turned out 125,000 more voters. 2010 that would show up in 2014. And when I was president of the NAACP, Van Jones on CNN called me the unsung hero of Obama's re-election because I turned out 1.2 million unlikely voters. We turn out the likely voters, we will beat Hogan. We turn out unlikely voters, we will wallop him. I'm in this to wallop him because we need people coming into the state capitol with a mandate to solve the big problems that are facing the people of Maryland. Healthcare, education. That's why I've been endorsed by the teachers. That's why I've been endorsed by the nurses. They now actually have the courage and the capability to pull folks together to solve these problems.
Well, Ben Jealous, it's been a pleasure to see you once again and have you back here on the program.
It's good to see you. It's good to see you.
Good to have you. Good luck on the campaign trail. We'll see you down the campaign trail and see how this all rolls out.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
We've been here with Ben Jealous, who is running to become the Democratic nominee for governor of the state of Maryland. I'm Mark Steiner for The Mark Steiner Show on the Real News Network. We'll catch you all next week.
All right, so we're going to keep following. We have a month from about right now. We have the primaries coming up in this state, and so we'll be following these elections. There will be a piece that Easy has coming up about why the elections.
Yeah, why the midterm elections are important. That'll be up next week. I just, it's good to hear Ben Jealous, like you said, sounding a little more gubernatorial. I just feel like this whole primary race is so dry right now, and I think a lot of people feel that way. I think a lot of people are not engaged in the fact that there's a midterm election going on. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out.
And I'm hoping to have something on the sheriff's race coming up, and then really get back to hammering hard on the state's attorney's race. So look out for that. Yeah. Anything good coming up in Baltimore this weekend that you guys are doing? We have the holiday weekend.
Yeah, it's Memorial Day weekend. There's all kinds of stuff going on. I know
you're performing at.
I'm performing at Autobar tonight. It's Friday, so I don't know if this will be up. But tomorrow there's Battle of the Kings of Baltimore, Baltimore Club Dance competition put on by Be More Than Dance.
That's cool. Where's that
should
at?
be pretty dope. I forget exactly where it is.
All right, well, look it up, folks. You have Google, too. And what time's your show at the Autobar?
Doors open at 9. Elon, Nina Gala, Dio Fashina will be performing. Me and my band Soul Cannon. We got 2 new songs we're pulling out tonight, so it should be cool.
Cool. You went to something cool at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum?
Yeah, there's a show on Arabber culture there. If you don't know what that is, it is the horse-drawn city-dwelling horses that are selling fruit, vegetables, and in the past, fish and all kinds of other stuff, mainly fruit and vegetables. Now, each Arabber has a really distinctive call, and they still are really crucially important, especially in elderly communities and stuff where it's hard to get to the store, maybe don't have a computer, try to order, the order up or whatever kind of stuff, or the Peapod or whatever these trucks and stuff you see around. That's the original of that. The Arabbers come, they call out, you come down and buy fruit and vegetables. There's some really beautiful photographs, historical ones, recent ones by Holden Warren, some really nice paintings, and a big mural, and there's one of the Arabber carts in there. So yeah, some of them were out last night for the opening, and yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah, and then also today there's African Liberation Day going on at New Shiloh Baptist Church. This is the Maryland Council of Elders event, Organizing Unity, Unifying to Liberate. So I'm going to check that out.
Cool.
Probably have something about that next week too.
Cool.
All right, well, maybe we always come in with Soul Cannon, but since you guys are playing, maybe we should go out with a Soul Cannon number.
Cool.
Soul Cannon number today.
Yeah.
That means you have to rap right now.
Huh?
We'll rustle one up and post.
Yeah, this is something that Soul Cannon did. Listen to it.
Thanks, David Hebden, for producing the podcast every week.
Thank you, Chris DeMillo, for stepping in for Stephen Frank today, holding it down like you always do, like a true gentleman.
And Dwayne Gladden for being the video producer of the Baltimore Bureau podcast show. You can watch us. If you're only listening, you don't know what you're missing. You can see us moving our hands, doing all kinds of things. And you can, if you're only seeing us and you're tired of seeing that shit, you can also just go to iTunes or SoundCloud or anywhere else, Stitcher, that you get your fine podcast, and check us out. Give us reviews, give us feedback, give us money, send us beers.
drinking an ice cold beverage. I'm in it with my nemesis, settle it. No time for your socialite standards. He's phony, she's fake, hanging from lanyards. The beat give me my energy, I cannot pretend to be at all interested. I'm all invested in fan music and paper. In that order, crack borders not gone. I ain't Jimmy, I'm gone. Give it to me in the way you want it return. I give it back with that buttery churn. People follow people, I'ma follow myself. Too many egos in the regal, better send them to hell. Gel, gelling like a felon, but unlike a felon, I'ma travel like Magellan. Much like a felon, I'm addicted to rebellion. So the selling of a book from the Bronze Age on sin is late. She prayed for a man, she said.